complexities of the literary phenomena in the Pentateuch reveal that it has gone through a long history of transmission and growth. For example, in Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 to 8, the divine name God is used. But in Genesis chapter 2, verses 4 to 9, the divine name, the Lord God, is used over there. While the Pentateuch has many diverse elements, it seems so unified to demonstrate the structural consistency, especially in terms of its chronology. Critical scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries seek to explain the existence of features within the Pentateuch that conveyed either a sense of unity or diversity. They explore the prehistory of the text, sorting out how the Pentateuch is drawn from different sources over time. The documentary hypothesis is one of the models historically used by biblical scholars to explain the origins and composition of the Pentateuch. It proposes that the Pentateuch is not a unified work from a single author, but is made up of sources combined over many centuries by many hands. The documentary hypothesis holds that the Pentateuch is a compilation of 4 originally independent documents, which are J, E, D, and P. J represents the Yahwist source. E stands for the Elohist source. D is the Deuteronomist source, while P is the priestly source. You may ask why they are JEDP but not YEDP. Remember, this hypothesis was proposed by German scholars. The German way of writing Yahweh starts with J, and that's the reason they use J instead of Y. Now, let's take a look at how these 4 different sources are identified. Firstly, in terms of the divine names, J source uses the Lord or Yahweh. E source uses God, which is Elohim in Hebrew. D source uses the Lord your or our God. And P source uses God, that is Elohim. Secondly, regarding the characteristics of the texts, J and E sources are written in narrative form. Sermons are a distinct feature in D source. Then lists, days, religious issues, laws on worship, etc. appear in P source. Thirdly, as far as the content is concerned, 50% of Genesis to Exodus 24 and fragments of Numbers belong to J source. Then 33% of Genesis to Exodus 24 and fragments of Numbers belong to E source. D source appears only in Deuteronomy. Then 17% of Genesis and Exodus 25 to Numbers 36 belong to P source. In the next slide, you can see the allocation of J, E, and P sources in the book of Genesis. And what about the dating of sources? According to the documentary hypothesis, the J source was dated 950 BC, and E source started it in 850 BC. Later, both J and E merged in 750 BC. The D source developed in 622 BC, and then the 3 sources J, E, D joined together in 600 BC. Then the P source appeared in 500 BC, and then finally the 4 sources J, E, D, P were combined in 450 BC. I would like to give a little bit of critique about this documentary hypothesis. First, scholars of this hypothesis tend to pull apart the texts when they identify their different sources. As Alison vividly puts it, traditional biblical scholarship has spent most of its efforts in disassembling the works of a complicated watch before our amazed eyes without apparently realizing that similar efforts, by and large, have not succeeded in putting the parts back together again in a significant or meaningful way. Secondly, a detailed and comprehensive study of the Pentateuch in its final form must have priority in sequence over the approach of source criticism. It is methodologically unsound to explore the prehistory of the text without having established a clear understanding of how the present text is constructed as a literary work. To do otherwise is to set the cart before the horse. Similarly, on pedagogical grounds, it is surely improper to expect students to appreciate and apply this kind of method before they have understood the content and literary structure of the received text. Thirdly, a clear understanding of the final form of the Pentateuch is important if we are to appreciate how it influenced later writers. The writers and earliest readers of the New Testament were all pre-critical in their understanding of the Pentateuch. They did not think in terms of different sources underlying the text, each reflecting a different theology. For them, the Pentateuch was a single entity. This was how they understood and interpreted. A version of the documentary hypothesis frequently identified with the German scholar Julius Wellhausen was almost universally accepted for most of the 20th century. But the consensus has now collapsed. Although there can be little doubt that diverse materials have been brought together to form the Pentateuch, it is also apparent that the narrative is more unified than many scholars allow. Since the 1970s, biblical scholars tend to study the final form of the Bible and treat the whole Bible as unified. And now it has become a current trend of scholarship.